Hello again, and welcome to another season, another episode of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. My name is Rob Nelson.
And I'm Mike Bakoven, and I would have a beer joke, but man, I take this stuff seriously.
Oh boy.
I think this is important. We're going to get into some major beer talk today.
Yeah, absolutely. You are joining us on what will be the first of two episodes featuring the topic of prohibition. Today's episode is going to deep dive into the local aspects of prohibition history here in Nebraska and Hall County specifically. And then a week from today, we are going to be talking about prohibition on the national stage.
Yep. And then for the second part of the podcast, we do something kind of interesting and head out to Prairie Pride Brewing, which is one of the local breweries here in Grand Island, and talk to Alex Briner, who is their head brewmaster. And he's got some interesting stuff he's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're also premiering a new pre-prohibition style beer that they have created for themselves and their business. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversation. It's a topic that Mike and I are both interested in, and I think the conversation is going to go really well.
All right, bottoms up.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Stuhr Crazy Podcast. My name is Rob Nelson. I am joined today by Carrie Stuhr, curator here at Stuhr Museum, and today we're going to be talking about prohibition in Nebraska. Thanks for being on the podcast. Just so to kind of jump in, let's talk more about and expand upon the origins of prohibition. And by that, I mean, I think we can start with the temperance movement in general. What is temperance to start with, and how did it become a movement in Nebraska, I guess?
Well, I'm not sure that I've ever looked up the actual definition of temperance, which I probably should have done.
Well, I can tell you that it means all things in moderation.
All things in moderation. Yeah. I was going to say, we're not going to tell you you can't have a drink, but we're really going to frown at you and make you feel bad for having it. So
yeah,
I think there's, along with alcohol and any vice, there are people that really believe it does a major disservice to the community, to families. You know, it takes away money, takes away relationships and all of those things. And so temperance, was also being influenced by things coming out of Europe and by, of course, money, because money is always an issue, and affecting really the whole of the United States. So have you been able to put your finger on what you think the origin of temperance was?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's always been a key component of American history, honestly. Even from the earliest days, there were thousands of temperance local chapters, local societies that numbered 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 even as early as the 1830s. And that kind of stuck with us until the repeal of prohibition finally in 1933. So more than 100-year history of temperance movements and just generally being associated with being against alcohol, the consumption and sale of alcohol. And in Nebraska, especially, we have had multiple instances where alcohol was on the ballot before it ultimately was illegal for 13 years in America. It was on our ballot a few times, correct?
Yeah. So one of the very first acts of territorial law in Nebraska was to outlaw the manufacture, sale, and consumption of alcohol. It was repealed, I think, in 1858, but then it went back on, or it didn't actually go back on, but they tried to control it by who the counties could sell it, or the cities or towns or the state or however. And actually, Nebraska passed prohibition a year early. So Iowa had it in 1916. We did it in 1917. Yeah, and then 1919.
Prohibition, the Volstead Act passed in 1919 and went into effect in January of 1920. But Nebraska, had already kind of crossed that bridge, as it were, and we outlawed it in 1917.
Go ahead. And even I was going to say, even when it was repealed in 1933, Nebraska kept it on the books for another year. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we actually extended it started it as soon as, lasted as long as we could.
I have a printout of the actual ballot from Nebraska and what was called the Prohibitory Amendment, which stated in 1916 that vote yes or no on prohibitory amendment number 300 and 301, stating, shall the Constitution of the state of Nebraska be amended by adding thereto the following: on and after May 1st, 1917, the manufacture, the sale, the keeping for sale or barter, the sale or barter under any pretext of malt, spiritus, vinous, or other intoxicating liquors are forever prohibited in the state, except for medicinal, scientific, or mechanical or sacramental purposes. Vote yes or no. And actually, the end result of that ballot measure was a 55.5 percentage in favor vote against a 44% not in favor a vote of, which, if you're concerned about the numbers, is 146,000 to 117,000 people who voted for that.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of gibberish, but you get the gist, I think.
No, it's a major issue. It was a major issue. And I think, again, when we're talking about Nebraska, we're talking about it always being an issue. And I think even up until 2021, there are still issues and still concerns with getting liquor licenses. And there's an argument between home breweries and kind of the off-the-shelf breweries and big distributors and all sorts of stuff. We could go into it. And so I think all of it has influenced kind of in the 1918, 19s, really was an exciting time if you wanted to talk about temperance and prohibition. Excitingly, I know you're going to talk to another staff member about the national scene, but Nebraska actually got those people visiting us too. Carrie Nation, which you'll hear about, who's one of my favorite suffragette characters, would go into the bars with a baseball bat and go bashing and breaking up the bottles and making a big scene and trying to get people to really, I guess it was like the very big campaign, that we see. And ever since the beginning, that's always out there.
Well, I know that, reminder for those who are joining us for the first time, we are at Stuhr Museum, which is a living history museum with our own fully functioning 1890s living history town called Railroad Town. And that town is a dry town, correct?
It's a dry town. It promotes temperance.
Exactly.
So, and we've had our fair share of, pop-up parades and, promotion of the temperance movement, which is a great time, a great thing to see, and a great thing to, walk in a moment in history's shoes and see that and see what that's about. Everybody's got the bar and the saloon that they can go in and get a sarsaparilla, but you can come to Stuhr and you can be told you will not have a drink here. Actually, it's very, very cool. And that's a big part, I would say. We have a huge German community, and that is very culturally accepted in early German communities to drink. And at the same time, there was this huge temperance movement. And so it's really interesting to go back in time and look at how those two things, conflicted and yet coexisted.
I've done a fair amount of reading on that subject, and I know that there's some recent papers that have been written about that connection. And if you're anti-immigrant, if you're anti-German, or any, insert racial or ethnic group here, and that population is home to several bars in a community, several saloons in a community that, promote a sense of belonging to that local place, that local experience for them. Also as a place of employment, a place to gather, those sorts of things. You can see how during the times we're talking about, late 19th century, early 20th century, how people could become, in quotation marks, part of the temperance movement. But really what they're trying to get at was they were anti-immigrant. And so in order to break up those sorts of, meeting establishments, people beginning to succeed and getting a foothold in American life, trying to take away that social center.
Taking care of, getting rid of the clubs and the income that those clubs are bringing in. And there's definitely, like I said, there's always that money angle that leads back to it. And, there's always been that, how many bars compared to how many churches are in town compared to how many clubs, and who's paying the fees to have a private club where you can do what you want to do, but the rest of the town can't. So Yeah, it's a very, I think, deep topic when really what you're talking about is whether you can have an alcoholic drink or not.
Exactly. And I mean, there are valid positions to both sides, like kind of what you were speaking to earlier. I mean, undeniably, alcohol does lead to violence. It does lead to
breakup of families. Just slothiness, laying around doing whatever. I think that, that's where we look at the churches, and then those people coming in and kind of talking about it and trying to persuade a generation to save people and do that. It's very much, I think, connected with the suffragette movement when people start to talk about, I love the quotes that come out of this era. There's a quote like, okay, if women get the right to vote, they're going to drive me to drink. And then and then they're going to outlaw the ability for me to drink. I mean, there's that. There's another one that says, we can't stop all the murder in the world, but that doesn't mean we go around and try and repeal it, that law. I mean, there's some really significant arguments and stuff that go on. So
yeah, and I mean, it gets kind of back to the idea of all things in moderation,
right?
Which
then there's the stories of how people got around the law,
Oh yeah,
and that's, I mean, I guess personally, I'll just go ahead and say it. I had obviously great grandfathers, and both of them had stills. And the family lore is that my great-grandfather, who came from Sweden and landed in Omaha, decided to move to California, but somehow he had a still in his house that, magically got there, and he wasn't able to just take it out to the trash or sell it or anything, so he built a false wall and hid the still inside the house and then sold the house to some unsuspecting family. Or maybe they knew. Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe there was but that's not part of the lore.
I just think it was everywhere. I think outlawing it, like, it gets us into this topic of like trying to outlaw moral, like, or to police moral behaviors of people. If people want to drink, they're going to drink, and we've proved that they're going to find a way to do it. I have several pieces of paper in front of me of the unique ways in which people got around that law. One of which was to hide bottles of alcohol in horse collars.
Right.
That they were shipping across state lines. So, I mean, and police were growing suspicious by the sound and then the weight of these things that weighed.
And the best part of some of these stories is how they were doomed to never work. Like those horse collars were metal, which are only shipped to the U.S. Army. And there was no army in Iowa. So
there you go.
They were like, what's all these horse collars doing here? Why are they clinking so much?
I mean, and it's in, I have another article here from the Grand Island Independent during Prohibition, and the title of it is "Police Make Whiskey Haul, and 3 more bootleggers are in custody." And it talks about an arrest of 3 people involving multiple vehicles and several dozen quarts of whiskey, and there's cars here and cars there, and there's, it just seems like you're making your neighbor into a criminal by making these sorts of these laws passing, and you see that like it. I can't think of another law, or at least especially amendment to the Constitution, that would pass with such overwhelming favor in 1 year, and then slightly over a decade later, it would be the exact opposite opinion held by people. Like, it's very, very difficult to pass a constitutional amendment. So the fact that they did it twice in the exact opposite direction really speaks to how bad this went, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and so one of the greatest decades to talk about, because the characters, so you talk about the antics that people did, and then the characters. So in the early teens, they talk about Omaha having like 4 mobsters that were running the dark side of the city or whatever, and somehow they left. Well, that was right when Prohibition was passed. And so there was one guy that was able to come in and just swoop it all up and become like the head honcho of the underworld.
Talking about
the
Denison.
Omaha underworld.
Yeah.
Yeah, Denison, and then all the characters he hung out with, which, Queen Louise has got to be up there at the top.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Tom Denison, professional gambler by trade, but strong man, political boss of the River City of Omaha. Nebraska may have been a place where temperance thrived, but I would say Omaha was its own world that was kind of, I mean, yes, it was in Nebraska, but in certain ways it wasn't
Omaha
otherwise.
Continues to sometimes be its own little world.
Yeah. And he kind of, ran that state, especially when it came to, the gambling, the underworld sorts of components, including alcohol.
Well, he really was able to, I guess, be more successful in those other areas because he was able to latch on to selling the alcohol and, providing alcohol for the speakeasies and the different places that, again, you can get money from. So, and I love, so he was connected with this Queen Louise character.
Whose name, for those of you who aren't familiar, is Luis Vinciquera. Was a resident of Hastings for a time. Was she in Omaha for a time? I feel like she was in multiple
Omaha, but
places.
she was in Lincoln.
In Lincoln, yeah. Multiple places throughout Nebraska.
She was a mom, had 2 kids. Regular, salt of the earth Nebraska woman. And yet was able to really build a business and become a fairly good businesswoman. Very successful. And yet she was, one time she was caught with 2 gallons of alcohol in her car. She was a passenger. And, right as the cops pulling her over, she was able to smash them together.
Yeah.
Alcohol goes everywhere. She goes to court and she's like, what? Transporting alcohol.
What alcohol?
I didn't get any alcohol anywhere. Alcohol didn't go anywhere.
There was no
transportation.
They were just on their way to the Nebraska football game, don't you know? That was their excuse. On their way to Nebraska football. Yeah, that was in 1925. So bug eaters, Nebraska bug eaters.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe not. I'm not good on my years with that. It wasn't Old Gold Knights anymore, but it was certainly around bug eater territory, I think. But yeah, and I was saying, turning your neighbor into a criminal, seemingly ordinary person who, found a way to carve out a niche because, and plenty of honest people, plenty of policemen, lawyers, public officials. Yes. It was one of the easiest things in America to be was a corrupt person when it came to prohibition because it was everywhere and there was no way to really ever police it. It wasn't successful, I don't think.
Well, no, and even policing it, I mean, sometimes they had to make up busts so that they could prove they were out there doing it. There's, the 2 UNL incidents that I think made the national news. Both of those are a little suspicious on whether it really happened or what was really the story or how bad the story actually was. So there's a lot to gain and a lot to lose just around the issue of alcohol. And I think that's why you talk about it not succeeding longer than 10 years.
Yeah.
Just because it became very complicated and almost more unhealthy situation.
And then also, something called the Great Depression starts happening 9 years into it. And you're sidelining those industries and people are in desperate need. And it definitely added fuel to that fire anyway to repeal. And, a lot of businesses, including local businesses, suffered from breweries closing and never got the chance to open their doors again. There were some that tried to, make it through by selling other things. I have a couple things written down that they used to try to make soda pop. They used to try to make malt.
Yeah, well, a lot of the soda fountain restaurants, candy counters and things were bars that were then turned into candy stores, malt shops, and things like that. But yeah, it was a very hard thing to turn around.
A lot of them got by also selling dairy products as well, like the factories themselves anyway.
I think there were at least 3 breweries in Grand Island that did not succeed, did not show up again after Prohibition. Yeah,
the one that I pulled is actually from Fremont, Nebraska as well, and this is a story of by 1902 being ready to go. The doors open in the 1880s, and then by 1902 he's really beginning to churn out. The man's name is Mueller. Churn out beer on a given basis, and then less than a little bit more than a decade later, the doors are shut, and he has to do what he can to survive. And that was the case for a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can imagine. I mean, just things that have happened even in our recent history, when you have to dump out so much of your hard-earned product, and let alone think about your labor and what you've built up and all of the other items that you need. That's a hard blow, and it is very hard to recover from that.
Yeah.
And I admire, I think, the spirit of all the states in the country that really did try to take that and work around it. But you have to realize that so did the criminals, and so did the hardcore alcohol drinkers. It was an amazing amount of creativity happening.
Absolutely. The Fremont Brewing Co., I should reiterate, by 1902 was producing 30,000 barrels annually of beer. And it came back full force in 1934 following the Prohibition repeal that came about through the 21st Amendment. But it did not last. It only lasted through the year of 1934 before it closed again. So like that's a story that is repeated on the national stage
time and time
again. But yeah, here you see in Nebraska, it's a real close to home sort of event that took place.
Yeah. Well, I know in a lot of the, transportation, the barrel makers, the distributors. So, it was, like you said, a wide range of people that were hurt and put out of business too. Not just the point of contact kind of sales. So
are there similar issues happening today that kind of harken back to that time of like policing, moral conduct? Like I'm like thinking about the marijuana legalization process that we're all going through.
I was thinking, wow, that is a really big hole you want us to go down.
No, I don't want to open up that can of worms, but it's just, I think there are parallels that it may end up following.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are parallels. I think that there's other parallels too that may not have the policing, but just the change with technology that comes in and makes something defunct, and everything has to be changed, and there's no other way to do it, because let's face it, nobody's going to buy CDs forever,
For sure.
So yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels that, aren't exactly one for one like marijuana or drugs or those kind of things. But yeah, you could even look at prescription drugs.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And then you can look at the lawsuits that go with that and the needs of the people versus, all the different things. So yeah, I think we learn from history, but the trick is not to repeat it so much.
Absolutely. And we're going to be, in the next segment of this podcast, kind of traveling out into the town and speaking with a local brewer today who is very knowledgeable of the history of his own craft and kind of the history of breweries in general and the ups and downs that they've been on. And his name is Alex Briner. He's the proprietor of Prairie Pride Brewing here in downtown Grand Island. So I think this is a good moment to hit pause, and we will be back with Alex Briner after these words.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Elfman's Barbershop. Fr. Elfman's Barbershop and Bath Room. Frank R. Elfman, proprietor. We are prepared to give you the best of service and offer both hot and cold water baths, elegant furnishings, and everything neat and clean and up to date. Come and see for yourselves, as we are yours to please. Special attention is given to ladies' haircuts, cutting in your own home.
Focused on Nebraskan breweries, and he has one of the labels, the original labels for the Prairie Pride beer that Hastings Brewing Company had. So when he was thinking of opening a brewery, he thought this would be a perfect name for a brewery in Nebraska, Prairie Pride, and we all agreed. Yeah. So we went with it. Well, a little after we opened, the family of the original brewer contacted me and said, "Hey, we've got the original recipe. And would you want it?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And it's in his handwriting. And so they emailed me the scans of this recipe, and it took a while because it's kind of in German. Some of it's in German, and some of the temperature, the words for temperature are kind of weird. But I realized it was in Celsius. So eventually got through it. Oh, and the hard part was there's 4 pages, but they sent me 3.
Oh.
So I had to use like Photoshop and see through. I could see the ink through it, and then I reversed it.
You're doing some national treasure stuff here.
Yeah. And I was able to figure out some of the rest of the recipe.
What kind of beer is it?
It's an American lager.
Okay.
It's your standard like Budweiser.
Yeah.
But it was the Budweiser that Hastings Brewing Company brewed instead of the Budweiser brews.
Sure, too.
So it's just your regular American lager, a very corn-based beer. Very unlike something we've brewed here before, but
Yeah.
we're excited.
Is it 2-row or 6-row?
It's 6-row.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of our other beers are all 2-row. So this is the first time we've ever had to order 6-row barley. And then we ordered the flaked corn too.
Does that differ from the German? Does it say 2-row or does it call for the 6-row?
I don't remember that it actually says 6-row, but when I did my research about what everything was brewed with back then, it was all 6-row.
Okay.
So that's what we went with.
So being you never made something like this before, do you do a test run beforehand, or do you just do a lot of research and then go all in and try it out?
Usually, I kind of just go all out, but this time we're actually doing a test run. So that's what we're doing today. This is the first test run of this beer we've done, and I made this recipe probably 2 years, copied their recipe that he had already and kind of formulated it 2 years ago, and we're finally getting around to actually doing it.
Is there something special about this era in terms of beer drinking, like the pre-prohibition era is prior to 1920? Is that special in your mind for any reason? It's special only because of probably nostalgia. Yeah, the nostalgia of it is why it's kind of cool to me, and it's it's the Prairie Pride beer, what we're named after. So it's important to me in that way. But the whole the beer culture back then was there was a brewery in every town. It was hyper local, and that's kind of what we're going back to with craft beer now. Is we're trying to get everything hyper local, get the mass nationalistic breweries, that have taken over the whole beer, world. For a long time, get them out of the picture and focus on local beers, and that's how it was back then. So then Prohibition shut that all down. Exactly. Yeah, it was Prohibition actually did a lot to really disrupt how it was. But it did good things in other ways. Like I'm thinking about how Anheuser-Busch and Pabst they own saloons, and they didn't even have to sell their beer to saloons. They just owned the saloons and sold their beer from them, and that's kind of gone away as a result of Prohibition.
Yeah.
But prior to Prohibition, you had that competition of microbrews and big corporations, and then during Prohibition, the huge corporations kind of took advantage of the time off, I guess, in some ways. They took to bottling soda, they took to really hyping up their manufacturing in terms of automobiles and stuff. So when Prohibition's finally repealed, they're hitting the ground running, where all these microbreweries were struggling to even exist or hang on at all.
Yep, and a lot of them got licenses for medicinal beer.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was aimed at pregnant women.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know
So
that.
totally backwards, but yeah. So they got definitely a leg up, and all the small breweries like Hastings Brewing Company and the Grand Island Brewing Company, they got shut down.
Has anything changed in the beer making process, from prior to Prohibition to after 1933?
Yeah. Well, there was a lot that changed. They didn't use as many types of pumps we have these days, so a lot of it was gravity fed. They'd have their mash tun up on a third floor, and their boil kettle on a second floor, and then their fermenters on a first floor, maybe. So they would, they'd use gravity, bring the beer from one step to another. And now we can pump everything. Another thing that's changed is they did a lot of step mashing, because they're the type of malted grains that they used, or unmalted like the corn. They wouldn't use any crushed corn or flaked corn like we use now, probably. So they had a longer process. They'd have to boil that corn first to soften it up, add in the malted barley to get those enzymes to convert everything over. And they have to do a step mash, so they'd have to start at 122 degrees, it's called a protein rest, break down some of those proteins, then move over to their regular mash, where they'd bring up the temperature to a little bit higher, maybe 150 degrees, and then bring up the temperature again for a third time. These days, we don't need to do all that. We just go straight to that middle temperature, that 150 degrees, or whatever your mash temperature is going to be, and we can go. But they had to do many, many more steps back then. It was much more important. And we're actually, with this pilot batch today, we're doing that. We're doing that whole starting at 122 degrees, like what he says in the recipe, and going to 146, then 168 degrees. And we're doing that step match that was more popular back then.
How long does something like that take, like from start to finish? That seems like a really elaborate time, step-by-step process that has to be followed perfectly.
It'll probably take at least 6 hours.
Okay. For a single bin, how much do you get?
And that's probably with some of the cleaning too. So we'll see. And with this batch, we're going to get 1 barrel, which is 31 gallons.
And are the barrels not wood?
They're not. We use steel kegs now.
I was reading that prior to Prohibition, like most beer was in wooden barrels. That's how you got it. There was basically no other way that you did get it. So I was just curious if you either had one made or pour it without it. Kind of cool.
That would be cool. The beer a lot of times wasn't carbonated back then either.
Yeah. I asked you earlier about the 2-row versus the 6-row, just in terms of the barley, because for all the beer nerds out there, there's like the 2-row barley is really popular in Europe. Like that's what they grow, and in the U.S., like 6-row barley is what goes into a lot of the beers that are made here. And like if you get into like the snobbiness of it, like people think like the 2-row is more clear and the 6-row is a little bit more hazy, and like that's responsible for the different taste or something like that. But I don't think that's actually true. I was wondering where you came down on that, like on the difference between the two types.
So my belief is we use mostly all 2-row here.
Okay.
That's primarily all we use. This is the first time we've used 6-row at this brewery, and that's to make this recipe. There is more proteins in the 6-row barley, so it does end up being a little bit hazier. But we're going to try to clear all that out of there too. There's some things you can do to clear some of that haziness out. And that protein rest should help with that first 122 degree step. But I think the 6-row is more popular for American ale or American lagers, maybe, but I'd say by far 2-row is probably more popular in America than 6-row.
Hey, by all means, jump in.
For us non-beer aficionados, can you please explain the difference between the 2-row, 6-row? Because I don't know what you're
Think of it like you've seen the head of a barley plant, where the seeds come out. This is a 2-row, and then a 6-row would be like this. Then there'd be more dimensions. There's 6 sides.
More dimensional. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's I guess hexagonal
So
if you looked at it from the top.
Variety of barley. Then.
Yeah, slightly. Yeah. Yep.
And then you get really into the weeds, no pun intended, when you're talking about like adding corn and rice. I think there's like a school of thought that like adding to that like really gets rid of some of that taste, and that's why you end up with like a flavor like a Bud Light or something in America. It's very palatable. It doesn't really offend anyone. It's just kind of if you like it, fine, but like that bland consistency, whereas like a 2-row is like, it's going to give you a lot more boldness and like a much richer flavor, I guess is kind of the argument there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and when you talk about corn, you're talking about ZMAs. And then, so in Europe, prior to the discovery of corn here, they didn't have, so the beers that were made earlier in time would have been different than if any corn was used. Because I didn't know that there was corn used in beer. I've only been to one place, and it's the Budweiser plant. So for a tour when I got married.
So when you use authentic older recipes like this, does the alcohol content come out drastically different than what we make today?
Yeah, it's quite a bit lower. Yeah, alcohol the content was much lower, and the further back in history you go, the even lower it gets. And they just didn't know a lot about the starch conversions back then. I think during this time they knew a lot more when Prairie Pride was brewed. They knew a lot more than they did in the medieval ages. But we know even more now, and they just didn't go for those really high ABV beers, I think, either, usually.
I actually think that is the result of Prohibition, is that like more higher alcohol content stuff actually becomes more popular as a result of there not being it available.
I just remember in one of Carolyn Converse's books, she talks about her father sending her to one of the places here to get a bucket of beer for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was evidently very common. And so the lower alcohol, if you think going back in history and looking at beer consumption, it was considered a safe drink. And so kids drank it.
Yeah. I'm wondering, since there was that lower alcohol content, you hear about people in Europe having a beer with breakfast and a beer with lunch and a beer at dinner, where that's different. So if we were to have a modern day beer that often.
But I still support the idea of beer at breakfast.
Doing really well in your cereal.
There's actually a pretty cool story about like what we're talking about right now legislatively in the U.S. Like the Volstead Act, everyone knows, like was kind of part of the 18th Amendment that was the Prohibition Amendment. But right before they passed the 21st Amendment, which essentially got rid of the 18th Amendment. Those two amendments cancel each other out, folks, for you U.S. constitutionalists. They amended the Volstead Act and it allowed for a 3.2% beer. And that was like, there's not like any magic number about 3.2% beer, but like the powers that be on the temperance side and the powers that be on the people who, the wets, as they were called, got together and they essentially agreed that 3.2% was the acceptable amount of alcohol that could go in a beer.
The safe number.
Yeah. And that was like what a lot of beer companies made their beer alcohol content like up until 6 months ago. Because Utah was the last state to repeal the 3.2% like max that you could have in a beer. But it would, like in Colorado, Oklahoma, a couple other states, Minnesota, like in the 2010s, they still had like a requirement that the beer had to be 3.2% if it was sold in the grocery store. In a grocery store.
Yeah.
So like nobody knows about that, but that's like because of Prohibition in 1933 before they repealed the Volstead Act that was like their compromise.
Well, in certain states, old person here, certain states, when you were a teenager, you could buy beer, like when you got to 18, you could buy beer in certain states, like we used to drive to, sorry kids, used to drive to Kansas and get 3-2 beer, Coors 3-2 beer.
Yeah.
And everything, because we could do that.
Yeah, we did that too. We looked for the 3-2 beer.
Yeah, we couldn't do that in Nebraska. But when I turned 18, I was legal in Nebraska, and that changed as I progressed. They kept changing the years until I got back to 21 again. But yeah, I remember going to get 3-2 beer.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was just called 3-2 beer.
Yeah, that's all we called it. Yeah.
Well, then, like all those companies had to make some kind of equivalence during Prohibition. Like that's where the term near beer comes from. Is from those people like trying to get under, and it had to be during Prohibition. It was like 0.5% alcohol content was all it could have, but they made all those near beer type. Like all the main companies had them. I don't remember what they were called, but like Pabst had one. I think Busch had one, but
Probably Schlitz.
Schlitz had one.
Schlitz would have been, the old German beer that were popular in the 19th century.
Alex, does Nebraska have any special laws currently that are unique to Nebraska about alcohol regulation, consumption?
We've got a lot of dumb laws.
Really? Please elaborate.
Well, and this is all my opinion, but and they're not. I don't think they're unique to Nebraska, but we've got like a franchise law for where basically your distributor. You have to get a distributor in Nebraska to sell your beer. If I wanted to sell my beer to XYZ bar across the street, I have to go through a distributor. And I can't just sell directly to that bar. Whereas most states would allow that. As long as your record keeping is squared away, you can sell to XYZ bar. But I have to go through a distributor. I have to drive, pick up my beer, and drive it over there. So they get a cut. Now, if I wanted to get rid of that distributor, because I don't like what they're doing, and I want to go to a different distributor, that distributor keeps the rights to my company and my franchise, my name, for a whole calendar year since they last sold to me. So let's say I'm at the end of my 5-year contract. They still keep my rights. For a whole calendar year, I can't sell my beer through a distributor unless some other distributor comes along and buys the franchise rights from that distributor that I have no say for or I'm not in control of.
Is there some kind of rationale for that?
It's all coming from Prohibition days.
Really?
Yeah, it's all basically the distributors will control the Well, let me back up. It's because the state has to make sure they get their money, their taxes. And if I was going to sell directly to XYZ bar, they think that they can't track my sales and actually get their taxes if I don't record everything correctly. So if I go through a distributor now, all of a sudden somehow now they can track it a lot easier. And I suppose that's probably true because then I'd have to screw up my paperwork, and the distributor would have to screw up their paperwork, and they're, if we were going to lie to them, it'd probably be easier for them to track it. I don't know how all that works, but most states have gone away with needing to go through a distributor. What we need to do is we need franchise reform, where we get rid of the franchise rights of, over my brewery that these distributors have, and then we need to get rid of the requirement for distribution in Nebraska, where I can't self-distribute. I'd still use a distributor. If I was going to ship to Lincoln and Omaha, I'm not going to drive the beer myself. I'm still going to use distributors. But if I wanted to be hyper-local and just distribute to Hastings, Kearney, Grand Island, I would do that myself. And I'd make a lot more money. It'd be a lot easier for a small brewery to make it in this a very competitive beer market, where right now I don't make any money selling 6-packs to distributors because they take such a margin. I have to sell it cheap enough where by the time the distributor adds in their price and then it goes to the supermarket, you're still wanting to buy it at $9 a 6-pack, which is still overpriced for a lot of people. So, but the reason that it's not changed yet is because Budweiser and all the big beer brands, they want to keep us having to go through a distributor because they have to.
Exactly.
It's unfair to them that we can self-distribute our beer because we're a brewery in the state when they only have a brewery in St. Louis, and we're maybe I don't know where all the Budweiser distributors are or breweries are, but they don't think it's fair that since they have to use trucks and distributors to sell their beer, that we don't have to. So we have to be on the same playing field as them, and they have all the money in Congress and the local governments to keep that from happening.
They could hire someone if they were really concerned about it, right across the street from their large facility in St. Louis or something. If they wanted to hire somebody to run across the street and sell Budweiser by the 6-pack, they could probably do it with all the.
And they probably could. They probably can in St. Louis. They probably allow self-distribution in St. Louis. I have to look at that.
And it is kind of self-distribution because you get a tour of that factory and they give you a beer. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that.
So if we want to support places like Prairie Pride, what's the best way to do it?
To do it like they did before Prohibition, go to your local brewery.
Exactly.
Come here.
Yeah. Yep.
What do you see as the future of like the situation right now? Are microbreweries still kind of on the rise? Is it reverting back to
I haven't looked at the numbers in a while. I think the last I looked, they weren't as on the rise as they were 3-4 years ago. I think they've kind of started to they're just kind of going. The line's not straight going up; it's just staying straight. But
I think that's because there was a huge market for them.
There was
15 years ago.
And I think a lot of coronavirus is probably causing a lot to close down. It's been a tough go of it this year.
Well, I know that things like Bud Light and all of them really are coming out with those things that aren't really beer anymore. They're coming out with seltzers and all these kinds of things that are alcoholic and tasty but they're kind of high alcohol content. And I'm wondering I don't know if it's been long enough to really know how much that's having an impact on the local brewery scene, but I feel like those are becoming really popular in a way that microbreweries were popular 5-10 years ago.
And I hate to admit it, but we actually have a hard seltzer here.
So there you go.
Did one. I was so against it because I'm just I like beer.
Yeah.
I just hated the idea of doing a hard seltzer, but I was finally convinced to do one, and it is the easiest quote unquote beer to make. It's cheap, it's stupid easy to make, and it's hard. You can't hardly screw it up. And it sells really well.
There you go.
I had to admit that it's maybe not such a bad idea to do one of these.
So throughout this past year of the pandemic, have you had a lot of local people in the community to continue and come and get growlers or buy 6-packs from you even at the height of pandemic?
Yes. Our off sale has gone up tremendously, and we've kept a lot of our local support. throughout this. What's changed is we haven't had the out-of-towners that we usually get. We usually, every day I could come into the brewery at, around 5 o'clock and talk to 2 or 3 people that came from out of state, and they looked up, they had a stay in Grand Island, I guess, and they looked up local breweries and they came here. We don't get that very much anymore. So the travel has gone down, the tourism has gone down.
Tell us about it.
Yeah.
Well, this is a history podcast, and I always like to ask somebody a history question. That's the last question of the podcast.
Oh, great.
Do you have a favorite story from Prohibition, pre-prohibition, on like the history of brewing in general that stands out to you?
Not that I can come up with off the top of my head. Who you should ask, though, is my business partner in this is Phil Cahoy. He is the pre-prohibition historian of the brewery. No, he's not.
Fair
But
enough.
I can get you his contact info, and maybe he can save my butt in this trivia question. This is a call a friend kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
That's an option.
Maybe we can end on this because I asked them in the back when I was wandering around. So this beer that you're brewing from the old recipe, is it going to be any good? Like, what are your expectations?
I'm super excited. I think it will be good.
Yeah.
I'm not such a beer snob that I won't drink a High Life or a Busch Light. So I still appreciate a good American lager, and I think this is definitely going to be a very good American lager.
Say the name for us one more time.
Prairie Pride Original.
The Prairie Pride Original, coming to a brewery near you. Well, Alex Briner, thank you for being on the Stuhr Crazy podcast.
Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Yeah, Alex, he's an interesting guy, and he's got a lot of brew knowledge right there. And I will mention that if you go to StuhrMuseum.org, our website right now, we have information on an event where you could come out to Stuhr Museum and try the Prairie Pride Original that he was talking about. And we had some last Friday. He let us sample it, and it is a interesting beer, and I say interesting in a good way.
Yeah, for sure. And it fits right along with this topic, so we couldn't have thought of anybody better to bring on the podcast to talk about Prohibition and all things beer drinking.
And it was so good. We're going to keep talking about Prohibition next week, where we're going to talk to Dr. Phil Cahoy, who also is a co-owner of Prairie Pride, but he's got a substantial collection of Prohibition era, what do you call it? Not artifacts, but just some interesting stuff.
Yeah, signage, all that kind of, not paraphernalia, but memorabilia is the word I'm
There you
looking
go.
for.
That's the word.
And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. This is a huge topic. There's a handful of those historical topics in American history that people really loved to discuss and enjoy, and one of those is Prohibition. So we left no stone unturned and no glass empty on this one.
Very good. So join us next week for the second part of Prohibition. We'll see you then.